40,000 American soldiers. That's how many lives were unnecessarily lost because of ego, stubbornness, and tactical incompetence from generals the history books call heroes. Not casualties from brilliant enemy tactics. Not deaths from unavoidable circumstances. Lives thrown away by commanders who valued headlines over strategy, glory over efficiency, personal redemption over the troops they were sworn to protect. Today, we're ranking the 5 most overrated American generals of World War II. Number 5 commanded the worst American defeat in the European theater and kept his promotion. Number 3 is a national icon whose casualty rate tells a very different story than his legend. Number 2 admitted he might deserve trial as a war criminal, yet he's celebrated in military academies. And number 1, his catastrophic failures were classified for decades to protect American morale. This isn't about questioning their victories or dishonoring their service. This is about the gap between reputation and reality, measured in unnecessary casualties, strategic failures that extended the war, and decisions that sacrificed soldiers for symbolism. Before we count down, hit that like button if you think you know who number 1 is, because the answer will surprise you. And subscribe so you never miss our deep dives into the uncomfortable truths behind history's legends. Let's start where American confidence died in the sand. February 1943, Tunisia, North Africa. General Lloyd Fredendall commanded American forces in their first major engagement against the Wehrmacht. This was the moment that would prove American troops could stand against the battle-hardened German war machine. Fredendall had every advantage: numerical superiority, air support, detailed intelligence on enemy positions. The Germans called American troops our Italians, expecting an easy fight. They were right. While his men prepared defensive positions in the Tunisian desert, Fredendall focused on something else entirely: his personal comfort. He spent $300,000 in manpower and resources, the equivalent of millions today, building a command bunker 70 miles behind the front lines. Engineers used jackhammers to blast through solid rock, creating a fortress complete with multiple rooms and protected tunnels. Meanwhile, his soldiers dug foxholes with their helmets and entrenching tools. Fredendall never visited the front. He commanded from his distant bunker, micromanaging unit positions on maps while remaining completely disconnected from battlefield reality. When officers requested meetings to discuss defensive preparations, he refused. When experienced commanders warned about vulnerabilities in American positions, he ignored them. Then, Rommel's Afrika Korps attacked at Kasserine Pass. Fredendall's response was catastrophic. He issued contradictory orders that split his forces across multiple positions. Units that should have supported each other were isolated and overrun separately. He refused to commit his reserves, holding them back even as frontline positions collapsed. Officers on the ground begged for reinforcements. Fredendall kept his reserves in place, convinced he understood the battle better from 70 miles away than the men actually fighting it. The result was the worst American defeat in the European theater: 6,000 American casualties in 5 days. Entire battalions broke and ran. Equipment worth millions was abandoned on the battlefield: tanks, artillery, trucks, ammunition. One German officer wrote home, "The Americans are not serious soldiers." The defeat shook American confidence to its core. Eisenhower arrived personally to assess the disaster. What he found was a command structure in chaos, a general who'd never seen his own defensive lines, and frontline troops who had no faith in their leadership. Fredendall was quietly relieved of command and sent back to the United States to a training position, where Eisenhower made certain he would never command combat troops again. But here's what should enrage you. Fredendall was promoted to lieutenant general and retired with full honors. No court-martial, no public accountability, no consequences. The army needed heroes, not scapegoats. So they protected his reputation, while the men who died at Kasserine became footnotes. The system saved the general. The soldiers paid with their lives. And Fredendall wasn't the last general whose ego outpaced his ability. Rome, June 4th, 1944. While the world held its breath waiting for D-Day, General Mark Clark had one obsession: becoming the first Allied commander to liberate a European capital. The strategic objective was crystal clear: trap and destroy the German 10th Army south of Rome, cut off their retreat routes, annihilate them before they could regroup and fortify northern Italy. Field commanders saw the opportunity. They had the German 10th Army in a closing vice. One more push, one coordinated movement to block their escape route, and over 100,000 German soldiers would be trapped. Veteran officers begged Clark to seal the trap. Clark refused. Instead, he diverted his forces toward Rome. Not because Rome had strategic value. The Germans were already abandoning it. Not because it would shorten the war. Military analysts knew it wouldn't. Clark redirected entire divisions toward the capital for one reason. He wanted the photograph. He wanted the headline. He wanted to be the liberator of Rome. 15 German divisions, more than 100,000 soldiers, escaped through the gap Clark left open. Those same troops would spend the next 11 months killing Allied soldiers in the grinding, bloody Italian campaign. Every one of those deaths can be traced directly back to Clark's decision to chase glory instead of completing the mission. But Clark got his parade. He got his photograph entering Rome. He got his moment in history. The soldiers who would face those escaped German divisions in the mountains of northern Italy got something else. This wasn't Clark's only failure. It was a pattern. At Anzio, his hesitation turned a surprise amphibious landing into a 4-month siege. Allied forces had the opportunity to break out and threaten German positions across Italy. Clark froze. His caution allowed the Germans to contain the beachhead. And what should have been a breakthrough became a bloodbath. Then came the Rapido River crossing. January 1944. Clark ordered the 36th Infantry Division into a suicidal assault across the river against prepared German positions. His own officers warned the attack was doomed. Engineers said the terrain made success impossible. Clark demanded they attack anyway. 1,681 American casualties in 2 days. 0 territorial gain. Absolutely nothing accomplished except adding names to casualty lists. After the war, veterans of the 36th Infantry Division formally requested that Clark be court-martialed for the Rapido disaster. They presented evidence. They documented the warnings he'd ignored. They showed how his ego had sent men to pointless deaths. The Army buried the investigation. Clark died in 1984, believing he was one of America's greatest generals. The men who served under him, the ones who survived, knew different. They knew the truth about what happens when a general values personal glory over the lives of his soldiers. One man's parade. Thousands of death sentences signed in pursuit of a headline. But overrated doesn't always mean timid. Sometimes it means reckless. Here's where people get angry. George S. Patton is an American icon. Profane, brilliant, fearless. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied commander. His Third Army raced across France faster than any force in military history. Patton is the general every American pictures when they think of World War II. Cool leadership, but here's what the textbooks don't emphasize. Patton's Third Army had the highest American casualty rate of any Army command in the European theater. 186,000 casualties. Let that number settle. Not because the fighting was harder in his sector. Not because he faced superior German forces. Patton's casualty rate was highest because he refused to wait for anything. Adequate supplies, favorable conditions, strategic necessity. He demanded constant offensive action, regardless of circumstances. Attack today, attack tomorrow, attack until the enemy breaks or your own forces bleed out. The Metz campaign exemplifies everything wrong with Patton's approach. September to December 1944. Metz was a heavily fortified city in eastern France with minimal strategic value. Military analysts recommended bypassing it entirely. The Germans were already retreating, and Metz would fall on its own within weeks. Patton refused. He threw division after division against prepared fortifications. 3 months of brutal combat, 47,000 American casualties for a city that could have been isolated and ignored. His own staff called it Patton's folly. Patton called it maintaining offensive momentum. Then there are the slapping incidents that nearly ended his career. 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, what we now recognize as severe PTSD, publicly humiliated and physically assaulted by their commanding general. Patton called them cowards. He struck them in front of their units. Eisenhower nearly sent him home in disgrace. Only the upcoming invasion of Europe kept Patton in theater. Now, compare Patton to Omar Bradley. Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group using methodical, careful advances. Bradley's forces actually killed or captured more German soldiers than Patton's, with significantly fewer American deaths. Bradley didn't make headlines. His battles weren't dramatic. But the mathematics are undeniable. Bradley was more effective. Patton's dash to relieve Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge? Brilliant theater, celebrated in every documentary. But the 101st Airborne had already held the town against overwhelming odds. Patton's arrival was symbolic, not decisive. The relief was propaganda gold, but it didn't change the outcome. Here's the uncomfortable question. Did Patton's aggressive strategy actually shorten the war? Or did it just look good in newspapers? Did his speed save lives overall? Or did it spend American lives for dramatic effect? The casualty statistics suggest an answer most Americans don't want to hear. Patton was undeniably talented, undeniably charismatic, undeniably effective at certain types of operations. But was he worth 186,000 casualties? Or was he a general who loved war more than he valued the men who fought it? The mathematics suggest the latter. But what happens when being overrated doesn't just kill soldiers, but civilians? March 9 to 10, 1945, Tokyo. General Curtis LeMay ordered 334 B-29 bombers to firebomb the Japanese capital using a new tactic, flying low, at night, with incendiaries specifically designed to create unstoppable infernos in wooden cities. The goal was total destruction. He achieved it. 100,000 civilians died in 6 hours. 16 square miles of Tokyo ceased to exist. American air crews reported smelling burning flesh at 5,000 feet. One pilot vomited into his oxygen mask from the stench. The heat was so intense that canals boiled. People who jumped into water for safety were cooked alive. LeMay's response when questioned about the morality of the campaign? I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. He knew exactly what he was doing. Over the next 5 months, LeMay's bombers systematically burned 67 Japanese cities. Total civilian deaths, estimated between 330,000 and 900,000. The stated strategic objectives were destroying Japan's war production capacity and breaking the Japanese will to fight. Here's the problem that military historians don't emphasize enough. It didn't work. Post-war interrogations of Japanese military and political leadership revealed that the firebombing campaigns had virtually no effect on their decision to surrender. Japan's military command was prepared to sacrifice every civilian in the country. They were planning for a final defense of the home islands that would cost millions of lives, and the firebombing didn't change that calculation. What actually forced Japan's surrender? Two factors: the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria that destroyed Japan's last hope of negotiating favorable peace terms. LeMay's campaign killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and accomplished nothing that the atomic bombs didn't render strategically irrelevant within weeks. The firebombing didn't shorten the war. It didn't save American lives in a potential invasion. It simply killed civilians on an industrial scale, while Japan's military leadership continued planning for total war. Yet Curtis LeMay is celebrated as a strategic genius. His autobiography became required reading at military academies. He was promoted to lead the Strategic Air Command. He nearly became Vice President of the United States in 1968. His tactics are studied as innovations in air warfare. But the children who burned alive in Tokyo weren't enemy combatants. They weren't soldiers. They were casualties of a strategy that demonstrably failed to achieve its stated objectives, ordered by a general who himself acknowledged the moral implications of what he'd done. No war crimes trial. No accountability. No reckoning with whether those deaths accomplished anything beyond adding zeros to casualty statistics. History remembers LeMay as effective. The evidence suggests otherwise. We simply assumed the bombing worked because the scale of destruction was so massive. But effectiveness isn't measured by how many you kill. It's measured by whether those deaths achieved the strategic objective. By that metric, LeMay failed. And then there is the general, whose myth consumed the truth. I shall return. 3 words that made Douglas MacArthur immortal. 3 words that defined American determination in the Pacific. 3 words that history remembers as a promise to soldiers and a threat to enemies. What history conveniently forgets is what happened before MacArthur left, and why those words were necessary in the first place. December 8, 1941. The Philippines. MacArthur had 9 hours of warning after Pearl Harbor. 9 hours to disperse his aircraft. 9 hours to execute the contingency plans he'd spent months developing. 9 hours to prepare his forces for the Japanese attack everyone knew was coming. Instead, his planes sat wingtip to wingtip on Clark Field and Iba Field when Japanese bombers arrived. Nearly every American aircraft in the Philippines, the entire defensive air capability of the islands, was destroyed on the ground. Not in heroic dogfights. Not defending against overwhelming odds. Destroyed while parked in neat rows because MacArthur couldn't make a decision. His commanders begged for authorization to launch preemptive strikes against Japanese airfields in Formosa. MacArthur refused to act without explicit orders from Washington. His air commander requested permission to disperse the aircraft to auxiliary fields. MacArthur delayed. Officers pleaded to at least get the planes in the air to avoid destruction on the ground. MacArthur hesitated. When the Japanese attack finally came, America's air defense in the Philippines was annihilated in a single afternoon. The catastrophe was entirely preventable. The responsibility belonged entirely to MacArthur. But the failures didn't stop there. MacArthur hoarded critical supplies in Manila instead of dispersing them to defensive positions. When the Japanese invasion forced him to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, 78,000 American and Filipino troops discovered they had rations calculated for 43,000 men and ammunition for perhaps 3 months of light combat. MacArthur's failure to adequately prepare supply lines condemned his own army. The soldiers fighting desperately to hold Patton were starving, not because of Japanese action, but because their commanding general had made catastrophically bad logistical decisions months earlier. Hungry soldiers can't fight effectively. Soldiers without ammunition can't hold defensive positions. The Patton defense was doomed before it began, not by Japanese superiority, but by MacArthur's incompetence in the critical months before the war started. This was the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Far East. This was the general responsible for defending America's most important Pacific possession, and when the moment came, when years of planning needed to transform into decisive action, MacArthur froze. Leadership paralysis at the exact moment when leadership mattered most. The seeds of disaster were planted in those 9 hours of indecision. What grew from those seeds would cost tens of thousands of American and Filipino lives. But MacArthur, he was just getting started, building his legend. March 1942. Corregidor Island. While 78,000 American and Filipino soldiers fought starvation and Japanese artillery on Patton, Douglas MacArthur made his escape. Under direct orders from President Roosevelt, MacArthur, his family, and selected staff officers boarded PT boats under cover of darkness and fled to Australia. The soldiers on Patton? They stayed behind to face what MacArthur's failures had created. Within weeks of MacArthur's departure, the starving, ammunition-depleted defenders of Patton surrendered. What followed was the Patton Death March, a forced march of 75 miles where Japanese guards brutalized prisoners too weak to walk. Men were bayoneted for falling behind. Prisoners were denied water in tropical heat. Sick and wounded soldiers were executed on the roadside. 10,000 American and Filipino soldiers died during that march. 10,000 men who might have been evacuated, might have been properly supplied, might have had a fighting chance, if their commanding general had done his job in the months before war began. But MacArthur wasn't on Patton when his men surrendered. He was in Melbourne, receiving the Medal of Honor. Read that again. MacArthur received America's highest military decoration for a campaign that ended in the worst American defeat in history. The Medal of Honor citation praised his leadership of the Philippine defense, the same defense that collapsed because of his incompetence. The award wasn't about military achievement. It was about public relations. America needed heroes, not narratives of failure. So they pinned a medal on the general who'd escaped while his army faced death and captivity. And MacArthur, he gave them the soundbite they needed. I shall return. 3 words that became a rallying cry. 3 words printed on posters, broadcast on radio, repeated in newspapers across America. It sounded like a promise to his trapped soldiers. It sounded like defiant determination in the face of defeat. But MacArthur didn't make that promise while standing with his troops on Patton. He made it after escaping to safety. He made it from Australia while 10,000 of his men died on a march he'd never have to take. He made it for the cameras, for the journalists, for history. I shall return wasn't a promise to soldiers. It was narrative control. It was reputation management. It was the beginning of one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in military history. A campaign designed to transform catastrophic failure into heroic mythology. The men who survived the Patton Death March heard those words differently than the American public did. They heard a promise from a general who'd left them behind. They heard words from a commander who'd escaped while they endured hell. MacArthur was building his legend. His soldiers were paying the price, but he wasn't finished. The return he promised would cost thousands more lives. And the reason why reveals everything about who Douglas MacArthur really was. MacArthur's island-hopping campaign across the Pacific was genuinely brilliant. Bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions, striking where the enemy was weak, using air and naval superiority to isolate entire enemy armies. It was innovative strategy that saved countless American lives. But then came the Philippines. Military advisors recommended bypassing the islands entirely and striking directly at Formosa or the Japanese home islands. The Philippines had minimal strategic value by 1944. Japanese forces there were isolated, cut off from supply lines, and no longer a threat to Allied operations. Taking the islands would cost American lives for objectives that didn't shorten the war. MacArthur refused every alternative. He insisted on liberating the Philippines, not because strategy demanded it, not because military necessity required it, because Douglas MacArthur had been humiliated there in 1941. And ego demanded he return in triumph. "I shall return" wasn't just a promise, it was a personal obsession. The Philippines campaign cost 14,000 American lives. 14,000 soldiers died retaking islands the United States could have bypassed entirely. Even MacArthur's own staff questioned the strategic necessity. But MacArthur needed his redemption narrative. He needed the photograph of him wading ashore at Leyte. He needed to erase the stain of 1941 with a triumphant return in 1944. He got his photograph. 14,000 families got folded flags. Then came the occupation of Japan, and here's where MacArthur's story complicates itself. His administration of post-war Japan was remarkably successful. He oversaw the transformation of a militaristic empire into a democratic nation. He showed genuine political skill, cultural sensitivity, and long-term strategic vision. The occupation worked, perhaps better than anyone expected. Does that success redeem the earlier failures? Does rebuilding a nation balance against the lives lost to ego in the Philippines? Does competent peacetime leadership erase wartime incompetence? History wants to say yes. The math says no. After the war, declassified documents revealed something else. MacArthur had systematically inflated enemy casualty figures, exaggerated his achievements in official reports, and suppressed information that contradicted his public narrative. His headquarters operated as much as a propaganda machine as a military command center. Officers who questioned his decisions found their careers ended. Reports that documented failures disappeared into files. MacArthur cultivated journalists, controlled his image obsessively, and built a mythology around himself that bore limited resemblance to reality. He was a showman first, a general second. MacArthur died in 1964, celebrated as one of America's greatest military leaders. His funeral was a national event. His legacy seemed secure. But the soldiers who served under him, the ones who survived Patton, who fought through the unnecessary Philippines campaign, who watched men die for MacArthur's personal redemption, they knew the truth. Competence in one arena doesn't absolve catastrophic failure in another. Success doesn't erase the cost of ego. And brilliant propaganda doesn't change mathematics. These 5 generals won their wars. Lloyd Fredendall's failure at Kasserine Pass didn't lose North Africa. Mark Clark's ego in Italy didn't hand victory to Germany. Patton's aggressive tactics didn't collapse the Western Front. LeMay's firebombing didn't prevent Japan's defeat. MacArthur's catastrophic decisions in the Philippines didn't cost America the Pacific. They all won. History celebrates them. Museums display their uniforms. Their names appear on military bases, in textbooks, in documentaries that treat them as heroes without qualification. But when you count the cost, in lives lost unnecessarily, in strategies driven by ego rather than effectiveness, In victories that came despite their leadership rather than because of it, a different picture emerges. Great generals win efficiently. They achieve objectives while minimizing casualties. They make decisions based on strategic necessity, not personal glory. They measure success in missions accomplished, not headlines generated. Overrated generals win expensively. They sacrifice soldiers for symbolism. They extend wars for reputation. They choose drama over mathematics. Fredendall's bunker was more important than his soldiers' lives. Clark's parade was more important than trapping the German 10th Army. Patton's momentum was more important than casualty rates. LeMay's scale of destruction obscured the strategic failure of his campaign. MacArthur's redemption was more important than 14,000 American lives. The difference between great and overrated isn't measured in victories or defeats. It's measured in what those victories cost. In young men who never came home. In families who received telegrams instead of sons. In Gold Star mothers who were told their boys died for necessary objectives when the truth was far uglier. 40,000 American soldiers. That's the number we started with. 40,000 lives lost not to superior enemy tactics or unavoidable circumstances, but to ego, to stubbornness, to generals who valued their own legacies more than the lives entrusted to their command. History wants heroes. We need heroes. We build monuments and write books and make movies because we want to believe that victory justifies everything, that the generals who won were therefore great, that success excuses all costs. But the mathematics tell a different story. The casualty reports tell a different story. The soldiers who served under these commanders and survived to tell the truth, they tell a very different story. That's not opinion. That's mathematics. So here's the question we'll leave you with. Who else belongs on this list? Which other celebrated generals won their wars but lost more soldiers than strategy required? Whose reputation exceeds their actual performance when you count the cost in body bags instead of medals? Drop your answers in the comments. Let's have the debate history refuses to have.